How many of you would like to hear my worst Mother's Day blunder of all time? That's sick, guys. I mean, come on. You just want to watch me embarrass myself. Well, and big nods over here. Okay, so here it is. It was actually the worst Mother's Day blunder was my first time to celebrate Mother's Day with my wife. Okay, so our daughter Anna had just been born. And throughout the time kind of leading up to it, we've been talking about, what are you going to get for your mom? And what are we going to get for Alicia's mom? And we've been dialoguing about it. And nothing has been mentioned about what we get for Alicia or what I might get and what do you want. And she just kind of assumed that Michael's being sneaky gift giver. And that's usually a safe assumption. I tend to be sneaky with those sorts of things. So she just didn't think anything of it. We talked about it some more. Mother's Day rolls around. We're out at lunch. My family, her family, we're all gathering together. It's this big celebration. We give the gift to her mom. We give the gift to my mom. And Aunt Amanda says, Michael, what did you give Alicia for Mother's Day? And I just looked confused. I said, it's not Wife Day, it's Mother's Day. So I got my mom something, and I watched all the mothers in the room, and their jaw just went, oh. And that's when I knew I was in trouble. It was a mistake I have never made since. And it was also the day that I realized that when you have children, Mother's Day is also Wife's Day. So there you go. Was that pretty bad? Mothers, do you hate me? Can you listen to any other thing that I say this morning? No, some of you are shaking your heads. That's so mean. Okay, today we are going to talk about navigating one of the most foundational, important realities of marriage. It's what the Bible calls leaving and cleaving. Leaving and cleaving. You ever heard of that before? It comes from Genesis chapter 2:24, the first verse in the Bible about marriage. The King James Version says, therefore shall a man leave his father and mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and the two shall be one flesh. Leaving and cleaving. Every healthy marriage has this as a foundation. There's a leaving of the old home and the old way and the old life in order to embrace a new way, a new home, a new life. And we tend to think that this is a one-time thing, like on your wedding day, you leave and you cleave and you're done. But this is not God's perspective of it. God's perspective of it is that leaving and cleaving is something you do even after your parents are gone. Leaving and cleaving is something you do until death do us part. Leaving and cleaving is part of every healthy marriage from day one until the very end. And so we're going to try to explain God's perspective on what this means so that we can have healthy marriages. We're in a series right now in the Song of Solomon. I think it was David or Nathan that mentioned that. The title of the series is Love for All Seasons. And that is, it's about building and cultivating a love that lasts. The Song of Solomon is a book of the Bible dedicated to love and romance. And so we've been walking through chapter by chapter. We're in the final chapter now. We have one more week next week, so you don't want to miss it. So we're in chapter 8. We're going to be in the first 7 verses. And just to kind of catch you up a little bit on the context, Solomon, he's the husband. Shulamith, she's the wife. And they were married in chapter 3, and so we've been kind of following their path as they walk through a winter season of marriage. And last week we got to their coming back together and their reconciling and this moving from winter into springtime. But springtime for Solomon and Shulamith was a little bit like springtime in Texas. You know when it's March and you're like, wait a minute, it got cold again? Oh, now today's hot, And so they're kind of in this sort of like in-between. And there's another sort of painful moment that begins to crop up its head, a difficulty, a challenge. Wilderness is the metaphor that's used that we're about to read. But what we're going to see is that in our wilderness, there is a purpose. And God's going to reveal that purpose. And one thing I want to say is I know that everybody here is not necessarily married. And we talk about this every week, that while this is a book about love and romance, there's a greater story of God's romantic love for us. And that is going to be part of the message today too. So there's going to be something for all of us. Song of Solomon, sometimes called Song of Songs, chapter 8, verses 1 through 7. If you have your Bible or your Bible phone, you can turn there. Oh, that you were like a brother to me, she says, who nursed at my mother's breasts. If I found you outside, I would kiss you, she says, and none would despise me. I would lead you and bring you into the house of my mother, she who used to teach me. I would give you spiced wine to drink, the juice of my pomegranate. His left hand is under my head, and his right hand embraces me. I adjure you, O daughters of Jerusalem, that you not stir up or awaken love until it pleases. Who is it that comes up out from the wilderness, leaning on her beloved? She says, under the apple tree I awakened you. There your mother was in labor with you. There she who bore you was in labor. Set me as a seal upon your heart, she says to her lover, as a seal upon your arm. For love is as strong as death, its jealousy as fierce as the grave. Its flashes are flashes of fire, the very flame of the Lord. Many waters cannot quench love, neither can floods drown it. If a man offered for love all the wealth of his house, he would be utterly despised. Okay. It is quite windy up here. I might have to go without notes today, guys, but that's okay. I can do it. All right, so here we go. I think we've got it. So you notice that in this passage, there were several mentions to mothers. And these mentions of mothers, there's a symbolic meaning of this. And Solomon's mother is mentioned, Shulamith's mother is mentioned, and this goes back to Genesis 2:24. It goes back to the idea of leaving and cleaving, that he's to leave his father and mother's house. And throughout the song, mothers are mentioned over and over and over again, and there's different theories about why fathers aren't mentioned. I'm not going to get into all of those theories, but the big picture of what's happening is that what Solomon is trying to do, is he is the author of this love song. What he's trying to do is he's trying to put flesh and bone on the Genesis 2:24 command to leave our father and mother and cleave unto our partner. He's trying to help us understand. He's trying to flesh out what it means for our marriages and for our families. And here is the first thing that it means, our first point today. The call to leave and cleave will be tested, especially in the wilderness. The call to leave and cleave will be tested, especially in the wilderness. So we see this in the first couple of verses, and it's really strange. I don't know, I feel like probably the youth group section had to have been snickering at this part when she said, oh, that you were like a brother to me. If I found you outside, I would kiss you. How many of you thought that was a little bit weird? Okay, so in the ancient Near East, there was a custom, like you could hold hands with your sibling, you could kiss your sibling in public because nobody thinks this is going any further. But if you were in love with somebody and you held their hand, if you were in love with somebody and you kissed them, in the Jewish culture, they would have shouted in Hebrew, get a room. And so what she's saying is they're coming out of this countryside where they've been away. And those of you who were here last night, you might remember, or last week, you might remember this. There was this huge public demand upon their marriage. It was a royal marriage, and they had to make time for one another. And there was like this constant battle, these constant demands, and now they're coming out of that sort of weekend getaway, and immediately she's having to pay attention to public responsibilities. If this was written in the 21st century, she might have said, I'm so sick and tired of adulting. And so she's tired of these public responsibilities and having to pay attention to if she sneaks a kiss with Solomon in public. And understanding chapter 8, what's happening here with the mother's house, you have to really compare and contrast with chapter 3, where almost the same scene happens. It's a parallel section. And in chapter 3, this was before they were married. And in chapter 3, before they were married, they go through a different hard season, and she brings Solomon back to her mother's house. And there, the mother's house is symbolic of security. And some of you who grew up in good homes, you know what that's like. There's a security in mom's house. Well, now in chapter 8, at the end of that season, she longs to go back to mom's house. She longs to go back to that place of security. The difference is this time she doesn't go. What's happening is that leaving and cleaving, so necessary for a healthy marriage, is being tested, and she's tempted to want to go back and rely upon her mother in an unhealthy way in the marriage. This reminds me of, I could say 1,000 different marriages, but I have just one friend in mind as I'm thinking about this. This was a friend who grew up in a home. He was an only child. His father was out of the picture. And when he became a teenager, his mom and him became like best friends. And they talked about everything, and they did things. And I didn't recognize this at the time, but later in life I did. He kind of became this almost surrogate husband to his mom. This sort of like emotional support for her, and it really went both ways. So when he got married, what do you think happened? When he got married, he left home geographically, but not psychologically. Psychologically, he was still at mom's house for the place of security. And so what happened is that when his marriage went through a wilderness season, he and his wife would be fighting one with another, and then he'd call his mom, and he'd discuss the whole thing with his mom, and he'd tell her things that he hadn't even told his wife first. Or maybe they'd be talking about, the age-old question, what are we going to do for the holidays? Christmas, Thanksgiving. Well, it turns out his mom wants Christmas and Thanksgiving. And what do you think they did? Christmas and Thanksgiving. They went over there. Wife didn't get a say. I see some angry wives out there. You're like getting angrier and angrier right now. Hey, I get it. And that's exactly how his wife felt. That sometimes the mother-in-law would come over and she'd say, oh, the house is looking a little dirty today. Have you dusted in the last year? Or she might say, oh, you use cloth diapers? Or whatever it is that she would say, she would criticize, and my friend would never defend his wife. And so one day at the end of this sort of wilderness-like season, it kind of culminated in this big fight, and his wife said to him, if you want this marriage to work, you have to decide whom you love more, me or your mom. And really, I think whom you love first. She wasn't asking that you hate his mom or that you dishonor. This would be biblically wrong. We honor our mother and father. What she was really asking was she wanted to know, as every wife should get to know, and for that matter, every husband, she wanted to know that she was first in her husband's affections. And that's part of what leaving and cleaving means. It's not just geographical, it is also psychological. And for that matter, it's just as much of a command for adult children as it is for mothers and fathers. Mothers and fathers, there's a letting go. There's an inappropriateness to you continuing to be the sort of primary support for your son or daughter, whether it be financially or emotionally or mentally or spiritually or psychologically. When you get married, that person, humanly speaking, is the one that you are to lean on. And God intends for the wilderness to actually drive us in that direction, and we'll see that momentarily in the song. But it's just as much a command for parents not to meddle in their children's marriage, and for adult children not to rely upon their parents in inappropriate or in wrong ways. So it's not just geographical. Leaving and cleaving is not even just psychological. We might even say that leaving and cleaving is total. It's total. And by this, I'm not talking about like never talk to your parents again kind of thing. Not at all. That's like what cults do, by the way. That's what cults do, okay? I'm talking about the comprehensiveness of the command, the breadth of the command to leave and cleave. Maybe you grew up in a healthy home and you have a healthy marriage with regard to how you relate to your parents and to the in-laws, and maybe narrowly you've kept Genesis 2:24. But have you ever been to a wedding, and of course you have, and you've heard the preacher say, do you promise to leave all others and cleave only to him? Do you promise to leave all others and cleave only to her? How many of you have heard that in a wedding? Do you notice how the preacher takes that narrow Genesis command and sort of universalizes it? In the broadest sense, that's what Genesis 2:24 means. And what happens when your marriage goes through the wilderness, when it endures one of those hard winters, when it's being tested, if you're not going to lean back on mom and dad, you might lean on something else. Maybe you lean hard into your work and you give yourself really hard into work, and it's how you're actually distracting yourself from the pain of marriage. Maybe it's you lean into kids' activities and you're doing stuff 24/7 so you never actually have to talk to your spouse about things. Maybe it's your ministry. Maybe it's your friendships. Maybe it's your hobbies. It could be any number of things. It can be an addiction. But what these things do, and Dr. Henry Cloud calls these intruders, where marriage is to be an exclusive relationship. And if it's not an unhealthy leaning upon a mother or father, it could be on anyone or anything else. And the command to leave and cleave is the command to give your spouse exclusive loyalty above 100% of earthly things. And this should cause all of us to ask ourselves a challenging question, and I'll ask you this question. Outside of God, who or what has had your chief loyalty in the last week? Speaking of married people. Outside of God, who or what has had your chief loyalty in the last month or in the last year? And now let's make the question extra dangerous. How would your spouse answer that question about you? How would your spouse say, oh, well, for sure, he's given me his chief loyalty. She's given me her chief loyalty over the past year. Healthy marriages do this. Do you see how much bigger leaving and cleaving is than we make it? And this is why the command to leave and cleave lasts for your entire marriage, because you have your entire marriage to forsake all others and cleave only to him or her, to show him or her that your exclusive loyalty is to that partner. And that's what the foundation is for a healthy marriage. It'll be tested in the wilderness, but there is good news even with that wilderness. The passing of the test is well worth it, because God has a purpose for the wilderness. He has a purpose for pain in the marriage, and this is our second point today. The purpose of the wilderness is to drive us to each other. The purpose of the wilderness is to drive us to each other. We see this in a few ways in the passage. In chapter 8, verse 2, she longs for her mother's security. Unlike chapter 3, she doesn't go back to mom. What we see instead is that in the very next verse, in verse 3, she leans, you find Shulamith, the woman's name, leaning into her husband's arms. So she finds her security, not in mom, because now she's got a new home, but in Solomon's arms. Verse 4, this has been such a good experience. She reminds those who are with her to awaken love in the right timing. To awaken love in the right timing. The pain of love, the pain of wilderness is worth it. And we really see this come out in verse 5 as it continues. And it says, who is this coming up out of the wilderness? Solomon is coming up out of the wilderness. And what is Shulamith doing? She's leaning on her lover. The wilderness is meant to get partners leaning not on the other things, not on the third parties. It's an exclusive relationship, not on any other person or any other thing, but each other. And what's happened through this long winter season, what's happened through this wilderness season, and what God wants to do in the wilderness of your marriages is he actually wants to use this to deepen the roots of your marriage, to cause you to lean more one into another. In chapter 8, verse 5, it talks about Shulamith leaning on Solomon. But what about Solomon? Does he lean on her? Is it kind of like this awkward lean? It talks about it for Solomon in a different way. I'm going to read verse 5 to you, and we'll unpack it. Again, it's more metaphor. It's difficult to understand. But here's what it says. She says, "Under the apple tree I awakened you. There your mother was in labor with you. She who bore you was in labor." Okay. So again, a mother is mentioned. So the theme of leaving and cleaving is still in mind. This time it's not Shulamith's mother. This time it's Solomon's mother. And Shulamith says, "Under the apple tree I awakened you." And what's weird about this verse is it sounds like to awaken, and we know this from verse 4, it's speaking of their falling in love. Chapter 2, verses 3 to 5, they fell in love under an apple tree. In the ancient Near East, the apple tree was sort of like the sweetheart tree. It would be the equivalent of mistletoe, okay? And so they fall in love under this apple tree. Now, if we took this literally, it sounds like Shulamith is saying, I fell in love under the very same apple tree that your mother gave birth to you. Man, this is getting weird fast, isn't it? Like, first you want to kiss your brother, then you fall in love with, I mean, I don't even get this, but it's symbolic. She's making a symbolic connection between Shulamith's role and a role that Solomon's mother formerly filled. What role was that? Well, in verse 5, it mentions it twice. She gave Solomon life. She labored to bring him forth in childbirth. So what Shulamith is saying is, Solomon, just like your mother made you alive, now that you have left and cleft, my love has awakened you. My love has made you alive. And if the mother is holding on to Solomon unduly, or if Solomon's holding on to his mother unduly, that love is not capable of thriving and growing. And this actually gives us a little bit of insight of what it really means to be a mom. And this is true throughout the song. It'll talk about mothers giving birth. It'll talk about mothers nursing their children, instructing their children. It talks about mothers nurturing, and then here is giving birth. But chapter 3, verse 11, that's the one that I wanted to go to. We see Solomon's mother again, and it's on the wedding day, and she's the one handing Solomon over. To be a mother from birth through childhood, teenage years, even into adulthood. To be a mother is to give away, to give away. And Solomon's mother, in giving her son away, allows love to thrive as Solomon establishes his new home. And that's part of what's happening. The other part of what's happening is twice she mentions your mother was in labor. And so this is just another metaphor for the pain of the wilderness that we already talked about. She's just changing metaphors. What this is talking about is the pain of love. And in the past, throughout this series, we've talked about Shulamith's broken road that led to finally falling in love with Solomon. And we've talked about Solomon's broken road that led finally to falling in love with Shulamith. The point of this birthing metaphor is that love is painful, but it also makes us alive. Love is painful, but it also makes us alive. And so for Solomon, that making alive looks like finding love not in mom's home, not relying on mom, but relying on his bride. And for Shulamith, it looks like finding security not in mom anymore, but in her husband. And the wilderness is meant to actually press that bond deeper. And your temptation, and you might be going through this right now, is going to be to turn to someone or something else when the marriage gets hard. But the call to leave and cleave drives us closer to one another. That's what it's intended to do. So one more question I want us to answer this morning, and this will take us into verses 6 and 7, which we actually sang about, and Nathan kind of introduced the song, "Set Me as a Seal Upon Your Heart, Upon Your Arm," that comes from Song of Solomon, chapter 8, verse 6. But here's the question I want to ask. Why is leaving and cleaving so vital to finding life and love? Why did God design it this way? Why is leaving and cleaving so vital? It's a question that we have to ask in our culture, because our culture says leaving and cleaving is actually not vital. More people are living together before marriage than don't live together before marriage now. And so the world's message is you actually don't have to leave and cleave. You can continue to cleave to your job. You can continue to cleave to your hobbies. You can continue to cleave to the back door. You can continue to cleave to your other options. You don't have to leave all of those things. You can have your cake and eat it too. You can have everything. But the message of the Song of Solomon, quite the opposite, is that leaving and cleaving is part of the nature of love. It's actually what love does. I've been talking about it so far as though it's the command of God from Genesis 2:24, and that's true. But leaving and cleaving is not just what God commands, it's what love demands. Let me say that again. Leaving and cleaving is not just what God commands, it is, but it is what love demands. By its very nature, love demands a leaving and cleaving. True love wants nothing less, nothing different than to leave and cleave. Because love by its very nature, our last point today, love by its nature is all-consuming. Love is all-consuming. Verse 6, set me as a seal upon your heart, she says, as a seal upon your arm. The seal was a mark of ownership. Shulamith is saying to Solomon, I want you to own me. I want you to possess me. Not commercially, romantically. I want to belong to you. And in a commercial sense, she actually clarifies in verse 7. She says, if a man was to offer all of his money for love, he would be utterly despised. This is a lesson that Solomon learned in his earlier years. Love cannot be bought because the price tag of love is your very life. So she's saying, set me as a seal upon your heart. I'm giving you my life. There's actually this desire. You want to be possessed by the other. You want to belong fully, to hold nothing back. That's what true love does, is it wants to give. But she's also, in that very act, asking to exclusively belong to him. It goes both ways. But the point between the two of them is that she wants to belong to Solomon. She wants him to belong to her. And when she says, set me as a seal upon your heart, she's talking about your inner life. Set me up as a seal upon your arm, she's talking about your outer life. Together, she's just saying, I want to belong to your total person, not part of you, not some of you, but all of you. For married folks, some practical implications of this is that if you're hiding part of your inner life from your spouse, you're not acting in love. If you're withholding part of your outer life just as well from your spouse, he doesn't need to know that, she doesn't need to know that, you're not acting in love. Love completely gives, and love completely receives. This is just what it does because love is all-consuming, and that's why I made the point about cohabitation, because Beyonce was right. If he wants it, he better put a ring on it, right? Isn't that what she said? He better put a ring on it. Why? Because the one who says he loves you, or she for that matter, they don't really love you unless they want to give you everything. There's this desire that just says, I want to give you my total self. That's what love does. It's all consuming. And the metaphors that she uses, she talks in verse 6 in the latter half that love is like death, like the grave, and like fire. And what all three of these have in common is that they all jealously consume everything in sight. Death and the grave consume all life. Fire consumes all wood or grass or hay or stubble or whatever it is. There's this consumption of everything in sight. And so what this shows us is that God's command to leave and cleave, when you really love the person, doesn't feel like a command. It's the most natural thing in the world. When you really love the person, you want to give yourself to that person, just as God so loved the world that he gave his one and only son. It's what love does. But one thing I love about the song is that it's not naive about this. It's not naive as if, hey, if I just fall in love with the right person, everything's so natural. It just takes care of itself. I'll just so naturally leave and cleave. I mean, love will just sweep me away. Like, it may sweep you away in the early stages, but as we've been seeing, love is seasonal. As we've been seeing, love takes us through the wilderness. And it's in that wilderness, as we've been saying, again, that we'll be tempted to rely upon other people and things rather than deepening our leaving and cleaving. And this is where the promise of verse 7 comes into play. And I read verse 7 as a promise, and it's a promise that is honestly really encouraging to me. It says, many waters cannot quench love. She's sticking with the metaphor of fire, that love is like this flame. And you can pour floods of water over that flame. You could put that flame in the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, and it would burn as brightly as if it was in a dry field. Nothing can put out the flame of love. The immediate natural response that we have is, yeah, but lots of people get divorced. Lots of people fall out of love, and bad things happen in marriage, and this happens all the time. And this is why we have to read this verse in the context of the song, where she's been talking to us about nurturing, mutually nurturing love. She's been talking to us about mutually awakening love. That is striking while the iron's hot. She's been talking to us in this section about leaving and cleaving and allowing that wilderness to press our love deeper, to allow our roots to grow more sturdy in love. The point of this section, the point of this verse, and the reason I consider it a promise is that I see it as she's saying, no flood of trouble can overwhelm the flame of a love that's mutually fought for. Love that's mutually fought for cannot die. Now that's a big if, right? It has to be mutually fought for. Some of you have had to deal with somebody who stopped fighting for the relationship, for the marriage. But I still see this as an encouraging thing, and here's why. Because just out in the world, there's so much talk about marriages don't last, and there's so much talk about people not staying in love, and they talk about it in this sense as though love just happens to you, and you kind of go with the flow until love goes away. And that's not the way this talks about love. It talks about love that if you both nurture it, it actually will stay forever. It actually will never die. It actually will never be overwhelmed. And the best thing that we can do as individuals is do our part to nurture it. That's the best thing we can do. And normally, the other person wants to reciprocate if we take the initiative in that. There's one more just little point that I want to make here about verse 6, about the flame of love. And I want to finish with this because it's going to point us back to God. It's going to point us back to the gospel. There's a little bit of a translational dispute because, and I'm not going to get into the depth of it. That's fascinating to me. If you want to talk to me about it later, we can talk about all the minutia of it. But translators have kind of struggled with, do I translate this as the very flame of the Lord, or do I translate this as the most vehement flame, like a very hot flame? Translationally, it could actually go either way, so you have to use context to decide. The English Standard Version that we just read actually says the flame of the Lord, understands that word to mean the Lord, that it's the Lord's flame. And here's why I think that's right. Chapter 8, verse 5, she says, who is this coming out of the what? The wilderness. The wilderness. Can you think of any other story in the Bible where someone or a group of people comes out of the wilderness? The Exodus. The Exodus story. And this love relationship is actually meant to point us back to the Exodus story where Israel was rescued, redeemed from slavery, rescued from Pharaoh's army, and they were guided through the wilderness by what? A flame. A flame. Just like the flame right here. And they were guided into the promised land. And this is God's way of saying, like, hey, I want you guys to, yes, I want you to see a love story. Yes, I want you to see a burning, fiery, passionate love between a man and a woman. I want you to get excited about the potential of that beautiful romance. But more than that, what I want you to see is God's fiery, romantic passion for his people. that the Exodus was not just about rescue and redemption, as amazing and beautiful as those things are. The Exodus was about romance. It was about God's fiery passion for his people, and it was a pointer forward to the greater, the greater Exodus of Jesus, who came and he rescued us. He rescued us from, some fell down behind me and I don't know what it was, but he rescued me from it, okay? He redeemed us out of slavery. He rescued us, and then he romanced us. And that is what the cross is really about. At the core of it, Jesus is the divine flame that left his heavenly home in order to cleave unto his bride. Jesus paid the price tag of love, which was his very life, given for us on the cross. 3 days later, Jesus rose again because his love is even more jealous than the grave. And once you realize that Jesus forsook all others to cleave only to his bride, once you realize that Jesus left his heavenly home to make a new home with us, to be united unto us, it makes you want to do the same thing for him, doesn't it? He wanted to do that for us while we were yet sinners. He's the desire of the nations. He's the King of heaven. How much more should we want to forsake all others and cleave only to him? You cannot embrace one thing without forsaking something else. You cannot embrace Jesus and the world at the same time. And so my exhortation to you is that in response to the divine flame of love, in response to what Jesus did on the cross and his conquering of the grave, would be to embrace Jesus today. Embrace him today. And the flame of divine love will guide you through your wilderness, and it'll take you beyond the grave. Let's pray.